Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello, so nice to see you again, and welcome back to the Poetry Week. This is the third lecture in the series. The earlier lectures we devoted them to the discussion of poetry, especially origins of poetry. In that context, we discussed origins of poetry in Sumerian culture, in African culture, Egyptian cultures, Chinese culture, Greek and Indian cultures and all that. Having discussed the origins of poetry, now it's time for us to discuss poetry and its types. And I choose to call the types of poetry tributaries. I'm sure you must have already noticed that choice of the word. And some of you may have as well made the connections, the reasons behind why I choose to call this, tributaries. If poetry is river, then types of poetry can be called tributaries, right? Can we call them tributaries? That's the reason why, having discussed the origins of the river, now we choose to discuss its diverse flows. That's the reason why we call it tributaries of poetry. In other words, different types of poetry. So before we proceed with the different types, I'm going to take you through a kind of an outline of the topics, what we are going to do in the next 25 or 30 minutes or so. So we are going to ask a fundamental question: is it possible for us to classify poetry into neat categories? Can we typify poetry into neat boxes? If we can, why we can? If we can't, why we can't? Okay. Afterwards, we take up for discussion different subtypes of poetry and whether these subtypes are they global ones or are they products of local cultures. Then we are going to discuss the three broad categories of poetry, and then of course after coming to terms with the three broad categories of poetry, then we discuss in detail different subtypes of poetry. This is a kind of an outline of how we are going to take this class through. All right. Okay. Now the question is, can we really box poetry into different categories? Can we do it neatly? Because we are dealing with a category of literature which is highly dynamic and volatile, and obviously if something is very unstable and volatile, you can't put them into neat boxes, right? You already know that. Nevertheless, for the sake of convenience, sometimes we have to classify poetry into various categories. Having said that, we also need to keep in mind what a wise poet once said, that there are only two kinds of poetry. One is good poetry, the other is bad poetry. Irrespective of the types in which you write your poetry, well, it can either be good or not so good, right? Okay. And poetry as a genre is not a static one, because if you look at the origins of poetry and if you look at the manifestations of poetry today, poetry has undergone radical transformation in its content, in its structure, in its outlook, everything. Therefore, poetry is not stagnant water. it's a kinetic movement, therefore it constantly keeps reinventing itself. That's the reason why when we classify poetry into so-called neat categories, sometimes poetry does not sit so neatly into those categories. So, we'll have to keep that in mind. Even while discussing classification of poetry, it's better let that classification be informed by poetry's refusal, defiance to be accommodated into such neat types. And how does this reinvention take place? How does poetry keep reinventing itself? Well, as we discussed during our discussion of Marxism, feminism, post-colonialism, it happens through the process of dialectics, It happens through a process of conflict with the earlier forms and the new forms, and that's how it constantly goes on reinventing itself and transforming itself. All right. So, now let us take a look at what happens when we identify the poetic, because at the end of the day, after having identified types of poetry, even in order to identify the different types of poetry, we must be able to distinguish what is poetic from what is not poetic, that we have already discussed in our earlier classes. Okay. So, now take a look at this poem or this particular piece. What do you call this? Right at the structural level, it does not look like a poem, because you remember in one of our earlier classes we had a discussion on prose and poetry, and from the look of it, it looks like a prose piece, because there are no stanzas or lines are not aligned or structured the way a poem is aligned. However, when you read this is when the problem of category comes to the fore. When you read this, that's when a doubt crops into your mind, pops in your head, saying, is this really prose? It looks like prose, but is it really prose? For time being, let us call it this text. This text is titled Bath by Amy Lowell. Let me read it out for you. The day is fresh washed and fair, and there is a smell of tulips and narcissus in the air. The sunshine pours in at the bathroom window and bores through the water in the bathtub in lathes and planes of greenish white. It cleaves the water into flaws like a jewel and cracks it to bright light. During our discussion of prose, we said that one of the distinguishing feature of prose, generally speaking, is that it's easy to understand. Even with a single reading, you would be able to make out. But what's happening here? What kind of imagery the so-called prose is using here? Look at the intensity of feelings, look at the richness of description, look at its diction. Little spots of sunshine lie on the surface of the water and dance, and their reflections wobble deliciously over the ceiling. A stir of my finger sets them whirring, reeling. I move a foot and the planes of light in the water jar. I lie back and laugh and let the green-white water, the sun-flawed beryl water, flow over me. The day is almost too bright to bear. The green water covers me from the too bright day. I lie here a while and play with the water and the sunspots. That's how the poem goes on. I have every reason to put this piece here because I said, from the structure of it, it looks like prose, whereas it belongs to, a genre called prose poetry. So, it's a kind of poetry, it's called prose poetry. And how do we know it? Not from its structure, because structurally it can be quite deceptive, but when you read it, when you listen to the lilt of sound dancing in your ears as you read it, that's when you know it should be definitely poetry. This is one example that we have to keep in mind. I have another one, okay. So, now look at these two structures here, one on my left hand side and the other one a crescent moon one, what do you call it? It looks almost like an image, almost like an image of something. The mouse's tail, in fact, it's a type of poem. Again, we don't know where to place it. Is it an image? Is it a verbal picture? What do you call it? It's still debatable. This is where classification of poetry becomes highly problematic. That's where we need to discuss this topic with a lot of nuances. That's the reason why I began this discussion of classification of poetry with the nuances first, so that once we are aware that there are nuances, then we don't take things for granted and we move on very carefully. So, this is also called poetry. In fact, it's called visual poetry. It's also called concrete poetry, shape poetry. There are different names assigned to this type of poetry. One of the distinguishing feature of this kind of poetry is that it creates a visual image which can be directly related to its meaning. So, the tail, the mouse's tail, the title of the poem, and the picture, the image there, it's related to the tail of a mouse. In fact, this was first used by Lewis Carroll in his well-known work Alice in the Wonderland. Okay. And we have several such things. So, here too we have a crescent moon. So, the poem is related to crescent moon, and that is how it is appropriately structured like that. The emphasis here is more on the typographical effect than on the verbal signification. Usually in poetry, verbal signification plays a major role, but here of course verbal signification is important, but more than that, the shape that you achieve by placing spaces, by placing your words, that becomes important, because the effect needs to be brought out. So, that is the reason why a poet here makes a clever use of words, letters. There is a poet even breaks a single word into multiple pieces, makes use of alternative spellings, even uses space in a very creative way, so that a beautiful visual effect, an aesthetic effect is achieved. So, these are some samplers to give you an idea about how poetry refuses to be classified into neat categories. From here we move on to our discussion of poetry. In fact, here is a brilliant line by a poet's poet, people's poet, called the poem is called Poetry. It's a stanza taken from that, and this is written by Pablo Neruda, one of the extraordinary poets the world has ever seen. Here he describes how poetry comes to him. In fact, this poem stanza reflects more on the magic of poetry, and how when we are in the presence of such live fire, activities such as classifying poetry into their types, how it becomes sometimes futile, because what is important is the spirit. When we are in the presence of a live flame, we need to enjoy it rather than doing it. Nevertheless, of course, for practical purposes, we still have to do it. And it was at that age poetry arrived in search of me. I don't know where it came from winter or a river. I don't know how or when. I don't know how or when. No, they were not voices, they were not words, nor silence, but from a street I was summoned, from the branches of night, abruptly from the others among violent fires, or returning alone. There I was without a face, there I was without a face, and it touched me. So, this talks about the alchemy of poetry touching individual and creating its magic there. Now, we move on to the regular aspect of this class. Okay. Initially, we asked a question: is the poetic forms that that we are going to study in this class, are they global or are they local? Technically speaking, obviously they will have originated these forms of poetry, subforms of poetry, types of poetry, they may have their origins in a particular place, but because poetry is cosmopolitan and because the world we live in is also cosmopolitan, well, they have traveled both spatially and temporally. In fact, some of the forms that we are going to discuss today, some of the types of this poetry, they are as old as literature itself, but today we still read them. Therefore, they have traveled quite widely in space and in time. That's the reason why I say that they may have had their origins locally, but they have now spread globally. So therefore, the better term would be now they are glocal, they are glocal. Before we proceed with our classification, this is something that we need to keep in mind. Stanza. Well, stanza for the uninitiated is the poetic equivalent of paragraph. In prose piece, what we call paragraphs. In poetry, they are stanzas. They are like a group of lines clubbed together, a group of lines of various lengths clubbed together for various reasons. Well, that grouping may take place on the basis of meter, rhyme, rhythm, theme, and sometimes even according to the choice of the poet, or maybe according to the conventions of the poetic type. So there are various reasons how a stanza is arranged. So here we have an excerpt from a poem called The Caged Bird by Maya Angelou. So in these stanzas, in fact, this particular stanza, the first one is comparatively longer, and the second one is shorter, okay, not in terms of length but in terms of number of lines. So this is the poetic convention. So this is how, in other words, what we need to remember here is a stanza is a series of lines grouped together, clubbed together according to either the conventions of the poetic form or according to the intention and choice of the poet. So according to the stanza, well, even poetry is classified. For instance, if it's a poem that makes use of 2-line stanzas, it's a couplet. So if it's a 3-line stanza, a poem made up of 3-line stanzas, you can call it a tercet. Similarly, a quatrain for a 4-line stanza, a cinquin for a 5-line stanza, and a sestet for a 6-line one, something like this. Okay. So this is something that we need to keep in mind. We'll come back to rhyme schemes, meter and syllable in a short while. But for time being, let's understand stanzas. Coming to the broad categories of poetry, we have 3 broad categories of poetry. The first one is lyrical poetry. The other one is narrative poetry. The third one is descriptive poetry. These we can call them the bigger tributaries of a river called poetry. So in lyric or in lyrical poetry, in fact, that's a predominant type of poetry that we see today. So it is written from a single perspective. Most of the modern poets use this form of poetry, and here we see the world from the poetic perspective, from the perspective of a single poetic persona here. And some of the types of poetry that belong to this broad type are sonnets, odes, elegies, and other things. Narrative poetry is something that has existed since time immemorial. In fact, if you remember, in the earlier classes we discussed the tale of shipwrecked sailor, Epic of Gilgamesh, and other Homeric epics. All of them belong to this tradition, this type of poetry, narrative poetry. So therefore, you can call epics, heroic epics, ballads as some subtypes of narrative poetry. The third one is descriptive poetry. So any poem when you read, if it focuses more on the external, if it focuses more on the external conditions of the world. If it makes use of rich descriptions, then you can call it descriptive poetry. Usually idylls, pastorals, haikus can be called descriptive poetry. Of course, these are tentative ones. That's something that we need to keep in mind. So, having discussed how poetry refuses to be categorized and some exceptions to these categories, and having discussed the broad categories, now we move on to the subtypes of poetry. The first one is sonnet. Sonnet is something that we need to know more. Again, there are different types of sonnets. You have Spenserian sonnet, named after the poet Spenser. You have Petrarchan sonnet, again named after the poet Petrarch. You have Shakespearean sonnet, again named after Shakespeare. So, what we need to know when we say sonnet is this, that a sonnet is a poetic composition done using 14 lines. So, if you come across a poem that makes use of 14 lines, generally it would be a sonnet. Of course, there are exceptions to it. There are sonnets that make use of 16 lines. There are exceptions to this 14 lines rule of a sonnet. There are sonnets with 16 lines. There are sonnets with 12 lines, So, these exceptions are there that we have to keep in mind. In fact, 16 lines sonnet is called a coda sonnet, and a shorter one, a 12-line sonnet, is called a curtal sonnet, that we have to keep in mind. But generally speaking, Petrarchan sonnets and Shakespearean sonnets are what we get to discuss and we get to see more. So, both Petrarchan sonnet and Shakespearean sonnet, they have 14 lines. The difference is in their line arrangement. The 14 lines are divided into 8 and 6 for Petrarchan sonnets. In fact, the first part has 8 lines and the second stanza has 6 lines with a kind of a rhyming pattern: ABBA, ABBA and CDE, CDE. In Shakespearean sonnet, the 14 lines are divided into quatrains or 4 lines, 3 quatrains of 4 lines each. 4 3s are 12, and the last one is a couplet. And here the rhyming scheme is A B A B, C D C D, E F E F and G G. So, what is this notation A B A and all that C D? We are going to discuss when we pick up a sonnet for discussion. You would get to know. Okay. Generally speaking, sonnets are used to express love, to represent exalted human feelings and emotions. We make use of sonnets. Think of any Shakespearean sonnet that you have read, you would understand what we mean by this. Okay. So, I have here a sonnet by Shakespeare, an extraordinary sonnet and an oft quoted sonnet on love. Okay. Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments. Love is not love which alters when it alteration finds, or bends with the remover to remove. Look how extraordinary, how immortal lines these are. It talks about love and says how love is not love which alters when it alteration finds. The concept of love here is given a noble touch. It's not something which is fickle minded. It does not change with the vagaries of time. It does not change with the vagaries of conditions. It's something that remains constant. Love is not love which alters when it alteration finds. It's a remarkable sonnet. Please take a look at it. And what is the rhyming pattern here? That ABAB, the notation that we did. Please keep this in mind here. So, what I will do now, look at this. So, here is a Shakespearean sonnet. Let us take a look at the rhyme scheme here. In fact, we said that in order to distinguish Shakespearean sonnet from Petrarchan sonnet, we need to look at how the stanzas are arranged and what is the rhyme scheme, right. So, stanzas you can make out here, because there are 3 quatrains, that means 4 lines stanzas, there are 3 of them are there, 12, and there is a couplet towards the end. Now, look at the rhyme scheme here. How do you mark the rhyme scheme? It follows the end rhyme scheme. That means you will have to pay attention towards how the last word of each of these lines ends, how the last word ends. So, look at the first line, true minds. Let the sound sir, because minds sir, right. Let it be a, let us call it a. The sound yes, a. Love is not love, were, the sound is were. So, let us call it B, the sound were. And the third line, finds. So, sa here is matching with minds there, minds, finds. Therefore, we can call this A. Love and remove, that remove rhymes with love. Therefore, were, this sound is B, something like this. Now, look at the rhyme scheme. A, B, A, B. And let us go to the next stanza, mark, the sound is ka, therefore, we can call it C. Never shaken, so this is N, the sound is N, therefore D. Bark, mark and bark, therefore, it is C. Taken and shaken, it is D. A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D. Similarly, you have sir, the sound is cheeks, E, F, E, F, come and doom, and then proved, the sound is G, the sound, loved, sound is G. So, this is how you mark the rhyme scheme. So, in order to know the rhyme scheme of a poem, you need to see, if it is an end rhyme scheme, you need to see how the last word, the last sound of the last word ends, and mark it accordingly. So, in a Petrarchan sonnet, we discussed this rhyme scheme is different. This is what we need to keep in mind. I am sure this would help us a great deal in identifying a Shakespearean sonnet from Petrarchan sonnet or other types of sonnets. I have here another interesting type of poetry called haiku. Haiku is generally associated with Japan. In fact, it has its origins in Japan, but these days it is no longer confined to Japan. It is now a global form. This is where you can recall our earlier discussion, how a particular type of poetry is born in a particular culture or in a particular geographical locale, and how that moves on later to the rest of the world. So, haiku has its origins in Japan. Haiku is a very short poem, So, it is a highly disciplined form, in the sense that there is no scope for extravagance here, there is no scope for verbal extravagance here. So, economy of expression is what matters a lot. So, you can trace it back to Japan, 17th century Japan. So, usually it is written using a stanza of 3 lines, a tercet. Okay. And generally speaking, haikus are highly meditative in tone. They are highly meditative, almost Zen-like quality, and they capture a mood or an image. Generally, haikus capture a single image or single mood. And generally speaking, they revolve around the theme of nature or natural phenomenon. So, this is in general haiku can be identified. A 3-line stanza evokes a verbal picture, revolves around nature or natural phenomenon. Let us take a closer look at some of well known haikus. So, here we have a couple of very interesting and well known haikus by Basho and Iza. These are masters of haiku. Of course, these are now available to us, they are available to us through English, in English translation. Now, look at these poems. On a branch floating down river, a cricket singing. It evokes a kind of a mental picture, and look at the imagery here. There is a branch floating down river. There is a river that is floating downwards, and there is a branch that is spread across it, and on that branch a cricket sits and sings. How all this is captured or evoked using almost minimum of words. On a branch floating down river, a cricket singing. Oh, here is another very well known haiku by Basho. An old silent pond, a frog jumps into the pond, splash, silence again. Now, look how evocative it is. Each line, each word here is capable of evoking, or you can even say it is capable of invoking a mental picture. So, it is like using the word and painting the picture, using the word and painting a picture with the help of that. An old silent pond, a frog jumps into the pond, splash, silence again after a while. From time to time, the clouds give rest to the moon gazers. From time to time, the clouds give rest to the moon gazers. How if you are fond of watching the moon on a clear sky, night, so occasionally how you are disturbed by wandering clouds sometimes. So, it is evocative of that image. So, what we have learnt in this class is some subtypes of poetry, and before that we discussed some exceptions to these subtypes and how poetry itself most of the times defies to be put into boxes. In the next class, we take up some more subtypes of poetry, and I am sure this would give us the necessary tool. This would equip us in a proper way to look at a poem and analyze it structurally as well. Until then, okay, take care, bye-bye.